Believe it or not, the reason I am into the original Spyro Trilogy is not because of the name of this channel or because I'm blatantly scaly trash, it's because my brother brought it home one day and I was mostly into racing games and shooters back then. I wasn't into platformers or collectathons, I honestly had no interest, but with the game in front of me, why not give it a try? We had an original PlayStation, and I mean, I was a kid, I did have some free time. At first, honestly, I was really lukewarm with the game. I didn't care to collect everything on the map, it seemed more like a chore. I explored the realms and then moved on as I could. Well, since the game loves to push it at you more and more, eventually you do start collecting more and more gems, and eventually you do get to a point where you realize, wow, I really should have been collecting these all the time, and you can't continue anymore. And then when you go back to the first worlds, there are gems in the opening areas, and you think, how did I let this happen? This is the point where you're hooked into Spyro. This is the point where you actually start really enjoying the game. Now, the first Spyro game I played was actually Spyro 3. I didn't play Spyro 1 and 2 until years later, but I did 100% complete Spyro 3 when I got it, after getting hooked to it, and, well, I mean, it didn't really have the impact on me that, say, Super Smash Bros. Melee or Halo did, where I would go home after high school and play with my friends for hours, but I still had those fond memories, that nostalgic memory. When I think of Spyro 3, the first thing that comes to mind is just an image of Midnight Mountain. I still have these, and I still remember the music, and it's still enough to get my brain to tick and remember it. So when I found out they were going to be doing remakes of Spyro 1, 2, and 3, I knew I was going to be getting it on release. What I didn't expect is that this remake, called Spyro Reignited, was only going to be $40. This still boggles my mind. This is a game released by Activision for not full price, $20 under full price. That alone is surprising with how greedy Activision is, but what's more surprising is that there's so much content here that it easily could have been $60 and no one would have questioned Activision. It's worth $60. Completing one of these games alone is going to take you about 14-15 hours, give or take an hour or so, depending on who you are. And there's 3 of these. That's going to take a normal person about a month to actually end up 100%ing all of these games, at least. So needless to say, just based off content, it's definitely worth the amount of money. But that doesn't really answer the question of, well, is it actually good? I mean, it's a remake, it's supposed to be as close to the original games as possible, so is it? Toys for Bob is the developer behind these remakes, and I'm happy to say they're very faithful to the original trilogy. So I guess we'll start in the most obvious place, graphics. Now, I played this on an original Xbox One, the old DVR looking thing. Do keep in mind that if you played it on a different console, it's still actually not going to be very different. If you look at Digital Foundry's video, the results were pretty much the same amongst every console. It didn't matter if it was Xbox One, PS4, PS4 Pro, Xbox One X. The only real difference is the resolution. The Xbox One is 900p, the PS4 is 1080. This is not very big of a difference, you really won't notice much of a change between the two. The Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro are both 1440. That said, they all have the same issues. Frame rate is 30 FPS, which I guess is fine given its consoles, this is what we're really going to be getting out of it. However, the frame rate does drop below that every once in a while, and every single version of the game, no matter what console you're playing on, has bad frame pacing, leading it to feel a little off when the frame rate dips. I noticed this the most in Spyro 3, not necessarily because it was less polished and more rushed than the other ones, but just because Spyro 3 has the biggest worlds. Now the game is certainly very playable. I would say about 90% of the time it stays at 30 FPS, and the other 10% of the time is when you start noticing those dips. It's still enough to point out, but it doesn't break the game. And again, I would like to reiterate, it doesn't matter what platform you're playing on. PS4 Pro, Xbox One X, Xbox One, PS4, they all have these issues. So I don't want to hear any fanboy console wars in the comments. As a PC gamer, I do not care. And the next question is if this is coming out on PC, because the other remakes did, so if this one does come out on PC, I would really urge you to buy it over there because that would just be the best version. You wouldn't be having frame pacing issues, you'd have 60 FPS, you know, all the same usual stuff you get out of PC gaming. And most importantly, you'd be able to turn off the awful amount of motion blur. My goodness, this is the thing that really drove me insane when I was playing this game. There is so much motion blur. There's no way to turn this off either. You need the motion blur, and I understand why it's there. It's there to cover up the frame rate issues and it running at 30 FPS. Some of it is needed at that frame rate, but there is way too much. At certain times this game would actually start making my head hurt. Not enough to give me a full-on headache, but if I'm staring at it, I just have to stop and blink for a moment before playing. And one of the other problems I had is that the camera is a little too close to Spyro. This makes charging enemies kinda difficult if they're close to you, and really made swimming difficult because you can't really see what's above or below you, and just moving isn't as easy as it should be if the camera was a little bit farther back. The other big complaint I had about the game is the loading times. My goodness, this game takes so long to load. You are going to learn to hate this stupid reigniting screen. Every time you die, this has to play and it has to load again. Just let me go again, I just want to play the damn game. Yeah, the loading is... it's gonna get on your nerves. That all said, I got all the complaints out of the way first so I can just praise the game from now on. Those are all the complaints I have. I legitimately just don't have anything else to complain about. And those problems are legitimate problems, but they're certainly nothing to make you not buy the game. Graphically, this game looks amazing. Now, they didn't take the Halo Anniversary, Halo 2 Anniversary route of taking the original engine and building on top of it, so it's not going to be completely one-to-one with the original games, but it's pretty damn close. Instead, Toys for Bob completely remade this game from scratch in Unreal Engine 4, which, if anything, is more impressive. I'm not sure how they managed to replicate the game in an entirely new engine so well, but it really does feel like the original Spyro games. Even more impressively is that they've added so much more detail to Spyro's world, yet it fits in so naturally with the lore already established. Nothing feels out of place. Things like, say, the dragon designs were entirely remade, but they still feel distinguishingly like Spyro. That's one of the appeals to playing the first Spyro game, is just to see the next design that they've changed that dragon into. I don't even see purists complaining about this, it just feels like Spyro. The only designs that stood out as being shockingly different, albeit still fitting in the Spyro world, was any design that was basically just an animal. Say, Sheila the kangaroo or that one whale. You know what one I'm talking about.
Man, I think they changed the design of Sheila quite a bit. She's got them hips now. I mean, look at that! Oh god, it looks so derpy now. What the f***? That is not how it looked originally. Why is it wearing shorts? Like, look at it. It looks like something you'd see in Ed, and Eddie.
The only thing I really would have liked to see added is the ability to toggle back and forth between the old graphics and the new graphics so you could really take in how much better it looks. Again, I want to bring up Halo Anniversary since you can do it there, and I know it's because they built on top of the old engine, so I don't know if it'd be possible in the Spyro remakes, but I wish it was a thing. You can, however, swap in between the old music and the new music, and here's one complaint I do have. I know I said I was gonna just praise the game from here on, but the music is a little bit odd. The new music is the old music just sort of recomposed and remixed, but something about it just doesn't really stand out. If you just listen to the music itself with no gameplay, it's great, and you can really get that nostalgic feeling, but as you're playing the game, it just sort of blends in with everything else, and you can't really hear it that well. I noticed if I went back to the old music, I heard the old music very well, and that still stood out and sounded great, but the new music just blended into everything, which is really weird. I don't think it's bad, I think the music is better than the old stuff, but again, I don't know, something about it with the gameplay alongside doesn't really work as well as the old stuff. But alright, I've ranted enough about how much better the game looks and just all the nostalgic feelings about seeing this old original PlayStation 1 ugly looking game that looked like a dog vomited onto the screen onto this beautiful HD remake. How does it feel? Well, the controls for the most part, again, feel just like the original Spyro game, but a little more smooth and a bit more fluid. The game, at least to me, does feel more responsive, but at the same time, if you went from the original one to playing this, you would be right at home. It wouldn't feel any different to you. And the same thing can be said about how the realms play out. The mini-games are the same, the whole game is the same. If you play the original Spyro games, everything is going to feel very familiar. You're still going to have mini-games that you love, and you're still going to have mini-games that you hate.
Trouble with the trolley, eh?
If you hated the raceways before, you'll still hate them now. A lot. I don't know anyone that likes these raceways, and that's something that has always confused me about the original games. The raceways were pretty minimal to start, and no one liked them, so the logical thing to do would be just not have them in the following games. Nope, they expanded on them, and made them even more annoying. Why add them back? Nobody liked them! This isn't a fault of the remake by any means, but just Insomniac, why? So then the question becomes, well, how well does Spyro hold up now? And surprisingly, I think it holds up really well. Again, I've never really been a platformer person, I never cared about collectathons, but Spyro was that one exception. And why was that? Well, it's because Spyro really isn't that much of a platformer. Spyro's emphasis was more on a pseudo-open world, and to make you explore the area. There was platforming, but usually that didn't result in pitfalls that killed you instantly where you had to restart all over again. I've never been a big fan of platformers because of this reason, I just don't find that fun. Dying over and over because you're not making one jump or you keep getting knocked back into an instant death pit, that's infuriating to me, that's not enjoyable. But Spyro doesn't really do this. The platforming itself obviously is easier because you have Spyro's glide mechanic, so you shouldn't be falling most of the time. And on top of this, if there's a place that you need to reach, generally you're not going to fall to your death if you don't make it. Generally it's somewhere you just didn't see, trying to enforce you to actually explore the world you're in. Spyro is a lot more laid back than the other platformers of its time, and I do think that translated a lot better to today's games compared to the other ones. You have complete freedom, for the most part, to do whatever you want to. Aside from some of the mini-game shenanigans, you don't have a timer on you, there's not a linear path, it's just you're dumped into this hub world and you go to a bunch of different realms as you please. Complete freedom, and I love that about it. And I think this is really why Spyro hooked me, but none of the other platformers did. And again, I think this translates into today's world quite well. You see how successful open world games still are today. In fact, they're more successful now than they were back then, mainly because technology now allows us to really do open world whereas it didn't 20 years ago. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the original Spyro games are still very fun games, even by today's standards. In order from my favorite to least favorite, I would probably put it as Spyro 3, Spyro 1, Spyro 2. I know that's a little strange because I know so many people list Spyro 2 as their favorite, which is a bit odd to me. I think it's because Spyro 2 had a very different sort of vibe to it than the other ones as far as like being child friendly. There's always a cutscene at the beginning and end of every level that's just kind of slapstick like child cartoon stuff, and that doesn't really mesh with me. But from a pure gameplay perspective, Spyro 3 just has the biggest worlds and in general is the most fleshed out game of the three. Whereas Spyro 1 also just kind of has the most interesting designs. Spyro 1 is the very raw Spyro experience. You're only playing a Spyro and it doesn't really get too crazy. Spyro 2 starts adding in mini-games and whatnot and they're sort of experimenting, whereas Spyro 3 has mini-games and different characters to play as and they've already learned from their experiences in Spyro 2. So Spyro 2 kind of feels like a blend between the two games, and I don't really think it worked as well as the third or the first one, although it's still a very good game. Regardless, this is definitely something I would urge you to play, even if Spyro was before your time, which is... saying that is blowing my mind. That's 18 years ago Spyro 1 came out. I'm sorry, 20 years ago Spyro 1 came out. Good lord. That means anyone below the age of, say, 24, Spyro's probably before their time. Though they might have played the Spyro games that came after Spyro 3, and if that's the case, don't do it, they're not as good. The exception of Legend of Spyro, which is just so vastly different that really you shouldn't be thinking about that either. I do love Dawn of the Dragon, that is arguably my favorite out of the entire Spyro franchise, but at this point you're basically comparing Spyro to God of War Spyro, and it doesn't really work. Anyway, if you have an Xbox One or a PS4, try it out, it's definitely worth the $40 they're charging. Also, if you're around my age and you want to feel older, System of a Down's latest albums came out when you were in high school, and that is now before the age of someone that is, say, 15-year-old's time. You're welcome. Anyhow, that sums up this video. I'd like to give a quick thanks to my patrons and people subscribed to me over on Twitch. If you want to follow me on Twitch, it's twitch.tv/Jarek4GamingDragon, and if you want to find me on Patreon, you can see it there, patreon.com/Jarek4. This really helps me. Please help me out on Patreon and Twitch so I can afford to buy groceries this month. Thank you.